Hi everyone, MC here. Every now and then there's a lot of discussion about what accessories to look for, so I thought I would make a video and talk a little bit more about this. Of course I couldn't do this without the help of other fellow COTC players, so kudos to them, and I'll keep this list updated as more people contribute to this presentation, and I will link this presentation in the video. So what we're going to talk about today is a big summary about A4 accessories and other accessories in general, some accessories that would come to pretty much every fight, some damage cap up A4s, must bring physical accessories that would be useful every time you're going to deal damage using physical weapons, must bring elemental accessories that would probably come every time an elemental team is employed. And then something about weakness-specific weapons, so items that inflict, let's say, dagger down or sword defense down. And as a bonus, we'll talk a little bit more about items that give ultimate gauge, and those are very useful for fast clears. So starting with the big summary. Which A4s should you prioritize? So in big summary, the first one, and pretty much most important, would be Bargello. And then one of A2's or Hanit EX, Hanit EX is being the easier one to obtain, of course. Then one of Hasumi, Primrose EX or Glorious. And for physical damage, Madeleine, Nicola plus Signa. And then Yelnong or Canary, Kaine, and Hikari. And for magic damage teams, we would have Varkin, Frederica, and then Signa or Xenia. And the reason for those A4s are going to be discussed in a moment, so bear with me. Now here's a quick note about defense and res down. Physical and elemental defense down, they cap at 30% for each category, passive, active, and ultimate. But then there's a specific weapon and element resistance down. So for example, sword resistance down or wind resistance down, and they cap at 30% for each category. But that's a separate category from physical and elemental defense. So if you consider dagger defense down as passive and then physical defense down as passive, those stack in different categories, so they end up increasing the damage multiplier. Physical and elemental resistance down count as all weapon or all elements resistance down. So for example, Signa's Corroding Nocturne skill, it debuffs in the same category as weapons and elements. So it's active weapon and element resistance down, not physical defense or elemental defense in the active category since it's being cast. So in summary, physical PDEF and EDEF, they are different from elemental and weapon resistance down or physical resistance down. I thought I'd make that clear because some accessories inflict physical defense down and other inflict physical resistance down, and those stack in separate categories. Now let's talk a little bit about damage cap up, some A4 accessories that increase the damage cap. Now why does damage cap up matter? The problem is the base damage cap in COTC is 99k. And if you take into consideration that enemy HP is already at 9 million, that would be, for example, Gertrude EX3, and then these values will get a lot worse, then it's very easy to see why damage cap up matters. If you want a quick fight, you really need to increase that 99k to a lot more. Eventually, most developed rosters reach a point where only the number of hits and the damage cap up matters, as long as the move potency is decent. So in big summary, the damage becomes essentially the number of hits times the damage cap. And to be fair, even now this is the calculation that we go for when trying to understand if we can kill a boss in one break or not. This is the calculation. So useful items, for example, Agnia's A4 and Bargello's A4, and characters that increase damage cap, they become increasingly more valuable. That's if you can slot them, if you have a slot available for the item, and in the case of the characters, for them. Now, we do have a bunch of damage cap up A4s, but it's interesting to note that most of these characters are limited, or in the case of Grieg, it's just a 50k damage cap up stick without any kind of physical or elemental attack, so it's maybe not the best accessory. But the ones marked in green are basically the ones that would be valuable to get from the exchange. So, for example, Oscar or Pardis or Bargello EX, it's not possible to get those items from the exchange, so they end up becoming very expensive in terms of spending real money, and pretty much out of reach unless you're really willing to spend on the game. Anyways, I keep hitting the escape button here, so let me bring back the presentation. So this chart, it goes to show why Bargello's A4 is so good, and pretty much the best one to get from the exchange. It's the only one that gives 100k damage cap up that you can get from the exchange. Now let's talk about accessories that probably will come to almost every fight. If you have them, of course. Some are 4-star A4, so you probably bring them anyways. And most of these accessories we're going to talk about, even when they're not 5-star A4s, even it's called whale accounts or accounts that have access to a lot of A4s, they will bring them in many cases. So to begin with, of course, the artifacts. The hero has to be level 120, and they can only hold one artifact. But if your main damage dealer will probably hold the physical artifact, if they're a physical damage dealer, or the elemental artifact if they are an elemental attacker. And then, of course, Vargelos A4 with 100k damage cap up is a de facto artifact or A4 accessory for dealing a lot of damage. It's really game-changing, and that's mainly because of how easy it is to pet stack and buff one single character to deal a lot of damage. It's a lot simpler to super buff one character than it is to buff a lot the whole front row, for example. So it becomes extremely efficient to have one character deal most of the damage. So this is a game-changing item. So if you think about a character that hits 20 times, that's 20 times 100k extra damage. So this is effectively an accessory that deals 2 million damage. There is no other accessory that has this effect. It definitely warps strategies around it in terms of using a single very powerful damage unit that has a lot of multi-hits. It's by far the best A4 you can get from the exchange, and it should be the #1 priority in terms of A4s if you don't have it, and you're looking to exchange Awakening Stones to get it. Next up, we have Debuff Extension accessories. So we have Kurtz A4, which you can get for free, and that's pretty convenient. And then we have A2's A4, also extends debuffs for 1 turn, and Honey EX A4. Of course, the one that you can obtain from the exchange is probably Honey EX. A2 is a very rare unit, and you can't get her A4 by exchanging shards. Debuff extension accessories are really useful. So the sweet spot for them, it's Chu. I very much use Chu pretty much all the time, if I can. So, but why are they so useful? One of the big reasons is that they can extend ult and passive debuffs. So debuffs that happen when a unit swaps roles, or ultimates that debuff. The extension accessories also apply to those. They are staples on, for example, Signa and Hanit EX, because they're debuffs. You want Signa's ultimate to last as long as possible, and Hanit EX debuff will last for 2 turns by default. So having that go to 3 turns is massive in terms of action economy. So for debuffs on hit, of course, Richard already has his own extension. So of course he doesn't need one of those accessories. But for example, Roland will apply debuffs for 4 turns. For example, if he's in the back row, and that becomes 6 turns with one of these accessories. It's a massive increase. It's really good in terms of action economy. The requirement of being full HP for Kurtz's A4 is really not a big deal. And these accessories, again, they are so good that it's worth having 2 of them if you can afford to. And then the easiest one to get is Hanit EX A4 from the exchange. Moving on to buff extension accessories. So there are no free accessories that will let you extend buffs, except for the Cosmic Fan, but that only applies to dancers. So the buff extension A4s are Hasumi, Primrose EX, and Gloria. All of them extend the duration of augmenting effects by 1 turn. Gloria's has the restriction that the unit has to be at full HP, but that's really not a big deal. Just make the buff unit fast and apply regen every turn, and there should be no problem. So they can extend ultimates and passive buffs. Oh, I'm sorry. About the debuff extension, Cosmic Daggers, they can extend debuffs, and then Cosmic Fans can extend buffs. So if you want debuff extension on a unit that's not a thief, or buff extension outside of a dancer, then you need these accessories. Again, this is a staple in Primrose EX because it can extend her defense, the physical defense skill, it can extend the ultimate duration, can extend the heal. It's just so good on Primrose EX. And again, being at full HP in the case of Gloria is not a big deal, so it basically stands where the others are as well. The one problem here quote-unquote problem. It's usually not that useful if the fight lasts 6 turns or less, because generally full boost skills will last for 5 turns, but sometimes boosting doesn't increase duration, so it can be useful in those cases. And then the simple one to get, and the most useful of them, is Primrose X's A4, but Hasumi has been around for so long that some accounts may even have got Hasumis naturally, in which case you probably don't need to bother about Primrose X, because one of these accessories is pretty much good enough. Now let's talk a little bit about automatic taunt or auto-taunt and the dodge accessory. There are some dodge accessories besides the Bewitching Cloak that you can get in the store of all 7, and they're good, but having 5 dodges for physical and elemental, it's the best you can get. The minus HP usually doesn't matter because this is done during the time that you take to set up the fight. So what do we have? We have Idea's A4, which is one of the best A4s in the game because it's not limited to 1 turn. At full HP, the accessory will inflict taunt to all enemies, which is excellent, for example, if you're using Canary as a tank. So Canary will tank the whole fight. And then if she stops tanking, that's because she ran out of dodge stacks, so you really don't want her tanking anyways. So this is an excellent accessory. Next up, we have Serenoa's A4, and this gives taunt for 3 turns, as well as Straybow's A4, another 3 turns of taunt. And these are really good, because they save 1 taunt action. Sometimes the character that you'd equip this on, like Canary again, they wouldn't have a taunt move. So this saves a move and sometimes gives the character a move that they wouldn't normally have, and that's enough to set up the whole fight. So on turn 1 and 2, while you still don't have the debuffs, the defensive buffs and debuffs are up. So that's when your party could get killed, and then then the party is set up to win the fight anyways, because the buffs are already applied and debuffs. So this combination of auto-taunt and dodge, it enables initial setup. Ideas is infinite, which is why it's so good. And those are basically 2 free actions for units that maybe wouldn't even have them in the first place. So the shorter the fight, the better this combination becomes. Next up, we move on to passive defense items. There are some other defensive A4s, but they're not worth chasing since we get so many defensive A4s basically for free. So the first one is these A4s, some of them like Hemi and Devin, they require that there to be a taunted unit, which is usually not a big problem because we just saw that there are some accessories that just auto-taunt. So Hemis is the best, and one of the reasons that these accessories are so good is that they can be equipped in the back row unit, so they can defend the front row unit without occupying an accessory slot. So in the case of Hemi, it can help defend from the back row, and it gives both passive, physical, and elemental defense. Miles, it can come from the back row, gives elemental defense. Serenoa's and Devin's, they have to be equipped on the unit, so they will take 1 slot space. They do provide passive defense, and they don't provide elemental defense. But if you have the slot to spare, they are very good accessories. And Serenoa's, of course, inflicts the automatic taunt, so that's an added bonus. And then there's Mina's, can also be used from the back row and provides physical defense. So if you're using a taunt accessory and your party is dying early on, well, these accessories are pretty much the best bet without changing the party to improve survivability. Now let's move on to some physical accessories. So if you're using a weapon, physical weapons to deal damage, these accessories will probably come every time if you have them available. So let's begin with passive physical defense down. And those would be Nicola, Signa, Tatlok, and Nier. Now Nier's A4 accessory, it reduces physical resistance, like we discussed before. This applies to all physical weapon types, so it stacks in a separate category, which is why it makes it so good. And another reason is that it doesn't even have to be equipped on the unit that's breaking, because it's just while there is a broken enemy, so it doesn't have the requirement of breaking the enemy. So Nicolas and Signa's A4s combined together, they will apply 15% physical defense down, and that's passive. And then with Signa's, that's another 5%. 5% doesn't look like very much, but since they stack in potency to 20% and in duration to 6 turns, that makes this combination extremely good. And then if you only have one of those, you can also try to RNG Tatlock's Awakening 4 accessory for a low chance of lowering physical and elemental defense of all enemies by 10%. Of course, Tatlock's A4 is a hard one to chase, especially because it can't be traded for. Same goes for Nier. But Nicola and Signa, those are ones that can be obtained via shards. Probably lower priority than the accessories we talked about until now, but still very good because having 30% passive physical defense down is not so easy to achieve. And one of the things is with Yanlong or Canaries A4, you can cap and get 30% passive physical defense down and extend the duration of that. So there's that added bonus. So by combining Nicola and Signa, you get 6 turns of passive physical defense down. Having only one of those, even with a debuff extension accessory, it becomes 4 turns, which is really a very small amount of turns. You'd need to break on turn 4 and kill on turn 5 to be able to extend the effect of the accessory, and that's we're kind of leading towards 6 turns, so that's a turn 5 break, so that's not quite enough by 1 turn. So having the combination of the two is pretty strong. Now, if you have Harley's A4, and Harley's A4 inflicts passive physical attack down, that combined with Signa's A4 gives a very nice physical mitigation. So it reduces damage by 20% for 6 turns at least. As I said, Nier's A4 will inflict 10% all weapon down, without even needing to be equipped on the breaker, so it's really good, and you can try to YOLO and get Tatlock RNG to proc. Let's talk a little bit about passive physical defense down, but on break. So on break, we have Yanlong's A4, lowering physical defense by 10%, Canary's A4, lowering physical defense by 15%, and then there's the added bonus of Dagger resistance down by 15%. And Hikari's A4, when breaking an enemy, it lowers physical defense and physical resistance by 10%. So these two, they stack, so it's a really good accessory, not to mention that the damage cap may be relevant. So Canaries, of course, is the stronger of the two. You'd usually pair that with a weapon defense down accessory. So usually the unit that's breaking will equip, let's see, maybe Yanlong's A4 and then an A4 or an accessory that reduces sword defense or axe defense, something like this. So you get to extend both the weapon defense down, which would be the physical defense down, and the physical resistance down. So you get to stack the damage on two passive categories altogether. Now for passive physical attack up, the only item that gives passive physical attack up from the back row is Madeleine's, so it's an extremely good 4-star accessory. So if you only bring one passive physical attack up character, so characters that have physical attack up as passives, that would be, for example, Richard, Bargello, Kilns. So if you bring one of them, then having the extra 10% coming from the back row is very convenient. You don't need to waste or spend an accessory slot on the damage dealer, and you can still get to 25 physical attack up passive. Let's talk a little bit about magic. So which elemental accessories are good? Well, to begin with, Varkin's accessory is probably coming to every elemental fight. So it lowers elemental defense of all enemies by 15%, and that combined with Signa's accessory, that would bring that up to 9 turns of 20% elemental defense down for just 2 accessory slots, which is a really good deal. Of course, if you can afford to bring Laura, you can get those 9 turns of 30% passive magic defense down without the other accessories, but then that requires spending a whole slot on Laura, which is not something that's always possible. And again, here you can YOLO and try to get Tatlock's A4 to proc, so a low chance to lower physical and elemental defense of all enemies by 10% for 1 turn. Of course, this can be extended by debuff extension accessories, but still, Tatlock's A4 is a difficult A4 and expensive one to get. So there are multiple ways to get 9 turns of passive physical or elemental defense, I should say. Elemental defense down. It can be extended by debuff accessories, and Signa's A4 is not needed if you can afford to bring Laura or Xenia's A4. Xenia's A4 inflicts elemental defense down on break, or you can try and rely on Tatlock or RNG if you happen to have her A4. For the passive elemental defense down on break, there is only one choice. That's Xenia's A4. It's the only accessory right now that inflicts 15% elemental defense down on break. The problem is that magic is not as good as physical damage, but if you happen to have this A4, it's going to come to every magic team composition. And then we have physical elemental attack up, passive, in one single item. So as long as the enemy is vulnerable to burning, then Frederica's A4 will give 15% elemental attack up, passive, to the front row. It's very useful in magic teams, especially because Isla will increase the passive cap from 30 to 50%. And since if you have Isla, he will always come to magic teams, that's going to help reach the 50% elemental attack up cap in the passive category. Now let's talk a little bit about weakness-specific accessories. And so the idea here is I'm going to talk a little bit in the order of, let's say, relevance of those damage types. Kind of right now and moving forward a little bit. So the point we're at is we're pre-release of Casti and Hikari. So we still don't have Tiziano yet at the time I'm recording this video. So some of the weaknesses will swap around. But this is kind of a list from highest to lowest damage. So let's talk first about Dagger. Now Tiziano is not released, but he's so strong that he's worth mentioning. His Awakening 4 accessory lowers Dagger resistance by 10% and implants Dagger weakness for 3 hits on break, which is extremely good. Because Tiziano himself can implant Dagger weakness and lower and give the Breaker unit the possibility to reduce Dagger resistance in the passive category. Force Canary's item is really good. Excuse me. Because it lowers physical and dagger resistance. And then we have Sonia's accessory. It doesn't have to be equipped on the unit to work. And the problem with dagger defense down is that it's quite premium. It comes from limited units only. But when Tiziano comes, we'll only need one of those. Now, of course, Tiziano's A4 is very strong by itself. Now, going on to X damage. So Casti enables X teams almost by herself. And her A4 accessory reduces X resistance by 30% on break, which is amazing. Which means it hits cap by itself regardless of the break turn. So for example, if you compare that with Xanta's A4, you'd have to break before turn 4 to get the 30%, or on turn 4, worst case scenario. But of course, there's a free version, and that comes from the Live Alive collab. So if you don't have Casti's A4, which is probably not a good idea to get on release because it would be very expensive, but we get to trade for Casti's A4 later on. We can replace that with the free Live Alive collab for a 10%. For Bow, so in the case of Bow, an upcoming unit called Hujeb will be extremely good for both teams, and he basically makes Bow one of the best damage types for quite a while. So we do have A4s that reduce bow resistance. If you have Ochet, then Ochet has a passive that reduces 15%. So one of these is enough to keep bow resistance down. Maybe not Lolo's because the bow resistance down is just 10%. But since it's a free accessory, this is the one that most people should go for. Now, of course, if you happen to have Xanta's A4 or Ochet is a Lumis EX, you can equip those in the unit that's breaking for some passive bow resistance down. Of course, Lolo's A4 being free is extremely convenient. And then let's move on to Sword. So Sword use it to be the absolute best damage type, but it's fallen off a little bit because of the support that other damage types got. It's still very effective against Light and Dark as well. So if you can afford to bring Sigrid, you only need one of these A4s from Joshua, Erika, and Jorn, since all of them inflict sword resistance down on break. And then again, the free Jorn's A4 is very convenient. The Hunter's Pauldron, when breaking an enemy, lower their sword resistance by 10%. When it comes to Spear, we have Luddites and Krausers, and both of them inflict passive polearm resistance down. Luddites is on break, and Krausers is when the battle starts. So if you have Roland, you can live with only one of them. So maybe Krausers is better if you have Roland because Roland gets to extend if his passive procs, of course. So there's a deal of RNG in there, but that's not very hard to happen. And if you don't, then probably Ludai because then you're not stuck to having to break on turn 4 because you can only extend the spear resistance down to turn 4. That's from Krauser's A4. Now talking a little bit about magic. For dark magic, we have free accessories that allow capping dark resistance. So by using Heinz, Wingate, Paula, and the Live Alive Solomon's Thibault, we get to reach the passive dark defense down to 30% pretty easily. So at the start of battle, Heinz and Paula's A4, they can inflict 20%, a combined 20% dark resistance down for 6 turns. And then the other two accessories, they will lower dark resistance on break. So if you're gonna break before on turn 6 or before that, you can only you just need to bring one accessory that inflicts dark defense down on break. So one problem, of course, is that sword, dagger, and bow they can pierce dark with very strong units. This isn't usually the best choice, but the trainer with her damage cap up is still a consideration if you don't happen to have all the meta units to deal the huge dark damage that we can do right now. And then there's fire. And for fire, Molus and Perigears A4 they inflict fire resistance down on break. And since if if you have Solon, he's definitely coming when the fight deals with fire. And so with Molu you can cap fire resistance down. With Perigears it's just 5% off, so it's still good. And the fact that Perigears A4 is free, it's pretty convenient. Now, other weaknesses. In the case of staff, tome, fan, wind, lightning, ice, or light, it's not, especially for example, wind and ice. There aren't many units that pierce wind and ice and do gigantic amounts of damage. But generally, you'd wanna most accounts would have better options. So of course you can use those for a challenge, but there's usually gonna be a better choice. Now, as a bonus, let's talk a little bit about accessories that fill up the ultimate gauge. And that's Auguste, Temenos, Trebo, and Kaine. Temenos being the one you can get from sharding, so if you're looking for that, then Temenos is the one to look for if you have the resources to spend on that. So these A4s, they are very useful for speed clears. All of them fill the ultimate technique gauge to 100%. Now, later on, we'll get ultimate gauges that can be filled to 200%. So this will fill one of the gauges. So if you have two of them, then you get to fill the ult gauge straight up without any action. And that's very useful for speed clears because coming up in JP, they have level 20 ultimates that allow non-damage ultimates to be cast along with a move from the front row unit. So for example, if you have Solon to improve the damage of a character, you can also have a damage dealer paired with Solon, and this damage dealer will also use their ultimate or their damage skill alongside with Solon. So these accessories, they become pretty good for speed clears. As final thoughts, if you're looking to get A4s, probably the first priority would be Bargellos, then one of Debuff or Buff Extension, one of each, and then passive resistance downs. So I don't recommend spending rubies chasing A4s, unless of course you have the money in real life to spare, then by all means. But they could become very expensive, and the most, let's say, cost efficient with shards that you will obtain naturally from duplicates, or maybe if you buy the Grand Explorer's Pass, you'll eventually be able to get a few of the A4s, and then Bargelos is probably it's definitely the best you can get from the trade. And then one each from buff, debuff, and then passive resistance down, and then you can go for your favorite weapon type. Now, again, in the long run, damage cap up accessories matter, because as roster powers grow, what ends up limiting the damage is exactly the damage cap. Also, don't be afraid not to if you don't have gacha A4s, because 4-star A4s and free accessories, they are really good and they will do fine in multiple situations. For example, with Yanlong's A4 and Jord's A4, those are free items to get. You get 10% passive sword defense down and 10% physical defense down, which is a big improvement to damage since they fall into different categories. Now, I want to be clear that this is not meant to be an extensive list and have all the cases for all A4s in all niche situations. These are just some A4s that if you take a look at most speed clears or clears from people that have a lot of A4 accessories, these are accessories that are pretty much present in all the cases where they're relevant. And so this not being an extensive list, you can just join COTC Discord and ask around. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone for staying this long and listening to this discussion. Thank you.